Good evening, English students. Welcome to part two of Unit 5. This is a recorded lecture without any people going through their things, emotions, and chat. The reason why I'm recording this as well, there was something that was going on in the chat at the time, and well, this is not something it was not something I wanted to post. It violated Discord TOS, though don't worry about it. The people who were violating TOS were banned. So hopefully that situation's been dealt with. Um, and hopefully it will not be an issue in the future because it does detract from, my experience as a lecturer. And it also detracts from your experiences as students, participants in all this grand scheme of things. Wow, that was really weird. Anyways, so yeah. As I mentioned, this is part two. This is all the fun stuff we'll skip through. This is what we went through over part one, and hopefully you all get all of this. This was all the buildup, and in the antebellum era, that would lead us to the American Civil War. So let's jump through this. Right. So we're going to cover the rest of it. We're going to talk about the Civil War itself and Reconstruction. That's the last few kind of era periods, I guess, that you would look at. So let's start off with 5.7, the election of 1860 and secession. So, the election of 1860 was very contentious. We had four different parties competing. We had the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, the Southern Democratic Party, and the Constitutional Union Party. Now, for those of you who remember his history from this period, well, the Republican nominee was Lincoln, and as we all remember, he will come out on top. The Democratic nominees was Stephen Douglas, the same Douglas that proposed the Kansas-Nebraska idea. Oh, no, not the Kansas-Nebraska idea, sorry. The idea of popular sovereignty that would be kind of repeated in Kansas-Nebraska. So it was that dude. Southern Democrats was Breckinridge. If you don't know who he is, you don't need to care about him, aside from the fact that I hate him as a person. And the Constitutional Union's nominee was Bell. Again, you don't need to know who that is. What you do need to know is what these parties stood for. So let's start with the Republicans. For the most part, they were on a free soil platform. And if you don't remember what free soil is, it's the idea that we shouldn't expand slavery. That doesn't necessarily mean abolition, although we had a fair share of abolitionists in the Republican Party. It's not going to be the entire platform that they will adopt. The Democrats, on the other hand, they weren't exactly let's keep slavery everywhere. They were more big on the idea of popular sovereignty, which is why they pretty much selected the guy who proposed popular sovereignty in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? The Southern Democrats were very pro-slavery. And the reason why we call them Southern Democrats is they were a group of Southerners who were part of the Democratic Party that split from the OG Party, the original Democratic Party. And the Constitutional Union focused on avoiding the slavery issue by kind of bringing back into the idea of compromises. Now, the percentage of the vote, the Republicans did not necessarily get the majority, as you can see here. Actually, you can kind of see here, they did get the majority in the Electoral College. But the popular vote, well, the Republicans, I guess, got the majority. They got 39.1% of the vote. The Democrats got 21.5% of the vote. And the Southern Democrats got 14.4% of the vote. Now, interesting enough, the Electoral College in the South down here seemed to side with Breckinridge, who was our Southern Democratic nominee. So this really shows that the Republicans kind of had more of an advantage over the Democratic Party. Why? Well, they weren't going through a split. In fact, they were the new party. They were the thing that came out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, out of discontent Whigs and discontent Democrats, forming this huge, very strong party that would mainly be most prominent in the northern area. And if you know anything about the North, well, it's going to be more populated. For example, just straight up look at New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio here. These three states, very stacked compared to what? 10, 10, 9. Georgia, North Carolina, and Alabama. Yeah, very small states down there. And of course, Bell is going to win these three states here: Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. That's not going to help the Democrats at all whatsoever. Kind of the effect of a third party. But enough of that. After the election of 1860, the South is going to threaten secession. Why? Well, they believe that, with a Republican president in charge, they're going to take our slaves. And, well, even though the Republicans said, no, we're not going to take away your slaves. We just don't want you to spread that kind of thing everywhere. Southerners don't listen. And so, eventually, we are going to get the beginning of secession, starting off with South Carolina. Pretty quickly, by 1861, we get our kind of confederacy here, and I included a picture. So the dark red and the light red are all going to be states that are part of the Confederacy. The yellow ones are surprisingly slave states that remained with the Union. So yes, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware all remained with the Union. Remember that Southern secession? It was kind of foreshadowed, so to speak, by the nullification crisis. Again, started off by South Carolina, the kind of sectional conflict between the South and the North, not just in terms of the economy, but just in terms of how they treated and viewed slavery as a side effect of that economy. So yeah, here's a little MCQ with a political cartoon. Attempt it on your own. I'll add the answer later on as the AP exam gets closer. Now, military conflict in the Civil War. Let's talk about mobilization. How did both the Confederates and the Union kind of fight this whole thing? You gotta draft. You need drafts. You need people to fight in an actual war. That makes sense, right? You also need to feed those people. If those people are going hungry, well, shoot. You're not going to have an efficient force fighting against, another force. It's no brainer, right? Now, they're going to implement drafts and rations, both sides, the Union and the Confederacy. And we're going to see opposition to the Civil War from both sides. The Union is probably more well known. It's the New York City draft riots in 1863, where we kind of see a whole conflict, mainly rising out of the Irish communities against these drafts. But also in the South, we will see what we will call the Southern Bread Riots, going on in the same year, 1863. Coincidence? Yes, it was. But you should understand that, well, during this entire thing, the Civil War is not exactly something that people were fond of. In fact, both sides believed, we'll be done, probably in less than a year. Obviously, the Civil War kind of kicked off in 1861 and ended at 1865 at the Appomattox Courthouse. So it was certainly not less than a year. However, that's still besides the fact that the Confederacy is going to lose, but I do want to mention the advantages that the Confederates had. Sorry, that was a little weird transition, but there were military initiatives. Initially, the Union was kind of taking a lot of L's. We had Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, etc. Very capable generals fighting on the Eastern Front, so the Virginia, Maryland area. The area closest to Washington, D.C. For example, the Battles of Bull Run, in 1861 and 62 will end in Confederate victories. For the most part, the Confederates are never going to able to capture Washington, D.C. Otherwise, well, that would be a whole different story. They will make several campaigns to try to capture DC, and by some miracle, they will be repelled. And that's where we will pick up with the Union. What advantages did they have? Well, they also had their pretty good leaders. They had generals such as Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman, a bunch of other generals as well. I would like to also mention our boy Meade, who will be one of the guys who will actually end up kind of putting an end to this whole Confederate campaign into Washington D.C. It will end in victory in Gettysburg in 1863. In addition, we will also see the use of the American Navy, under the Anaconda Plan proposed by General Winfield Scott. The idea of the Anaconda Plan was to blockade the entire South and to starve it to death. And if you remember something about rations and the Southern bread riots, that suggests that there was some degree of success to the Anaconda Plan. Now, of course, the Southerners tried to not let that happen, but of course, the blockade to some extent did have its effect. What ultimately sealed its fate, the Southern Confederates, will be the collapse of Vicksburg in 1863. What that opens is kind of the ability for generals such as William T. Sherman to kind of cut through this entire South. They're going to march to the sea in 1864. They're going to capture Atlanta, and that actually gives Lincoln a big win over his political opponent, McClellan, in the election of 1864. Finally, we are going to see the last battle of Five Forks in 1865, and that will seal the fate of the Confederate capital in Virginia, Richmond. I also want to say that the Union had a far better kind of advantage in terms of technology and economy. We mentioned in the Market Revolution, a lot of railroads were in the North, not in the South. Barely any railroads in the South. They had stable middle classes. They had a more kind of stable economic base to kind of fund this war. The South, it's a plantation economy. And with a plantation economy, you're not raising food. You're not kind of manufacturing. You're not exactly self-sufficient as an economy. So they're going to struggle more with kind of maintaining the war effort. In addition, the North's population had free laborers. They had huge urban centers, a lot of immigrants, a lot of people moving up to these kind of urban centers in search of jobs. These people are also going to be incredibly important in the war effort. All right. Now let's move on to government policies during the Civil War. Now, what do I mean by that? We're just talking about the Union, because the Union will have two kind of important things: the Emancipation Proclamation and kind of the notion of slavery versus American democracy. Now, let me preface the Emancipation Proclamation idea. Diplomacy with foreign powers. Foreign powers loved the cotton they were getting from the South. They absolutely loved, all the finished goods that they were also getting from America. And so when you get this blockade, well, that cotton's going nowhere. So Europe is going to obviously be a little bit concerned with this whole Civil War thing going on. Now, another thing I want to mention about Europe is that they are abolitionists. They kind of outlawed slavery a long time ago. Britain outlawed it very far back, around 1840s, if I am correct. France, a lot of these European countries. We're going to see attempts of blockade runners to kind of continue this kind of connection with Europe. However, the Union's going to make an important move, Lincoln, by the way, and that's going to be the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Now, what did this mean? Well, it changed the point of the war. Initially, Lincoln and co. wanted to preserve the Union. They wanted to bring things back whole together. But this proclamation will redefine the meaning of the war. It was to free the slaves. And this is important for Europeans. Well, if they're going to continue supporting the South when the Union says, hey, we're freeing the slaves, then, well, that's not going to look good among an abolitionist public. So what they're going to do is, well, yeah, no, that's not our problem. They're fighting for a moral cause. Let's not interfere with that. And they don't interfere with it, which is good news. But another thing about this is that African Americans, like Susie Taylor, who will be an African American nurse who will serve under the Red Cross, many African Americans, whether or not they were enslaved before the Civil War or where they would be freed during the Civil War, they will be able to enlist in the army. We will see the rise of all black regiments. fighting in this civil war because they know what the meaning of this war is to them. They lived through that slavery, or they know someone who had lived through that, whether it's through friends or family, right? Another thing about this is that this connotation of slavery being pretty bad is going to carry throughout Lincoln's rhetoric. For example, at the Gettysburg Address in 1863, Lincoln is going to set up this idea of slavery versus American democracy. That slavery is something that cannot exist along with the kind of whole democratic systems they have in place. So yeah. Now, let's move on past this SAQ to Reconstruction. So, yes, the Union will actually keep their word. No duh. They free the slaves. So, what happens after that? Well, you got a devastated South. You've got to reintegrate the southern states. This is a period we call Reconstruction. We rebuild the country. So let's talk about a few things, a few important things. Let's start with the most important things, the amendments that come out of this Reconstruction era. I'm talking about the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. And my God, they are pretty important in American history, but as well as Gov. But you're not here for that. So, what does the 13th Amendment say? No slavery except if you are a prisoner, if you are serving as punishment. We will talk about how this is actually kind of an issue later. In the 14th, natural citizenship. If you're born in the U.S., you are a citizen of the U.S. And that is to the federal government's discretion. You also have the idea of due process applying to states. And this 14th Amendment is going to be used for selective incorporation in a variety of cases that will kind of apply this kind of amendment, this right or something to the state level. And we will discuss those to some extent and throughout Unit 8 and Unit 9, but that's unimportant. Of course, the last one, equal protection under the law. The Equal Protection Clause was meant to protect African Americans, equally with other white Americans under the law. Seems simple enough, right? Now, the 15th Amendment is going to really drill this down. You have a right to vote, and you cannot have that taken away by the states on the basis of race. Right? Okay. I think those amendments are simple enough. However, let's talk about women's rights. What happened to the women's rights movement at this point? What happened after Seneca Falls? Well, women are going to be emboldened. African American men, mainly men, are going to have these rights. They have the right to vote. They have equal protection. So they're going to feel, yes, we can make progress. We can, expand all this to women, right? So we're going to see kind of efforts such as Susan B. Anthony voting on purpose and getting arrested for that because, well, she's not allowed because she's a woman. And in this era, women cannot vote. Another thing we will see is Bradwell v. Illinois in 1872, where Bradwell will argue that she had a right to a license to practice law in the state of Illinois. Now, unfortunately, people are still misogynistic in this era, and they are going to side with Illinois and not Bradwell. So, yes, there are setbacks. Women are also going to feel kind of split over this exclusion of women. For example, African American women such as Frances Harper are going to point out, hey, you guys are free, but we don't have these kind of luxuries as women as well. That's kind of unfair. And yeah, they're right. It is unfair. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, and all of these activists are going to push more actively over this idea that, wait, hold on. What about us? Don't forget the women. An Abigail Adams quote. And that won't change until, unfortunately, Unit 7. So, yeah, it's going to be a long road until we actually see suffrage happen. Finally, in this slide, let's talk about race relations, and balance of power. So one of the things that the federal government's going to establish is the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865 and was signed into law. The purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau is to help out freed men, aka African Americans who just got out of slavery. With what? With education. For example, they're going to work in kind of setting the foundation for several universities, such as Fisk University, Hampton University, Dillard University, Shaw University, Howard University. And for some of you guys who are in African American studies or have heard of those universities, hopefully you guys know that these are historically black colleges and universities. At the same time, we are going to see the role of Christians kind of working in uplifting African Americans. We're going to see the American Missionary Association, the Home Mission Society, kind of working through this as well. In fact, one of those universities I mentioned was kind of established with its first president as a member of one of those Christian societies. I will not give you the specifics because I want you guys to search that up for your own time. In addition, they also provided provisions in clothing. African Americans came out very poor. They didn't have property. They didn't have anything like that. So they're not going to have enough money to, have their food, to even afford their own clothes in the South. But also at the same time, we're going to see a lot of proposals for land reform. Kind of taking land and kind of redistributing it in a fair way. Now, land reform is going to be extremely unpopular among Southerners. And this policy of land reform is actually going to fail for a variety of reasons. So let's kind of segue to the politics of Reconstruction. What's going on? Well, let's start off with the good news. African Americans could politically participate. Woo! 50% of the South's offices were held by African Americans. We'll see important African American senators and congressmen also working on the local level. An example of an African American senator is our first one, Liuren, who is legitimately an awesome guy. We're also going to see the rise of union leagues, and what these union leagues are for, well, they're there to help African Americans, actually politically participate, whether for voting drives and all that. Something you would get out of AP Gov, right? This is also going to be supported by a Republican Congress, a Congress that will be controlled by two factions of Republicans for the most part. The Radicals, under Thaddeus Stevens, and the Moderates. What this Congress is going to propose, they're going to propose the Reconstruction military districts. They're going to put in troops to make sure the South is enacting naughty. Of course, Southerners being Southerners are going to put up some kind of protest to that. In addition, Congress is going to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866, our first piece of legislation that addresses civil rights. Well, is it going to be big enough to fix everything? No. As we know, in the future, Reconstruction is going to fall apart. They are going to try their best to address some issues, such as the KKK. They're going to pass the Force Acts in 1870 to say, hey, KKK guys, you need to stop, please. And they're going to pass the KKK Act in 1871. Again, they're going to put a firm hand against these kinds of racist guys. But one of the key oppositions is not just, the whole racist groups going on around killing people. It's also going to be Andrew Johnson. Now, you guys probably remember, Lincoln was assassinated very shortly after the Civil War. Lo and behold, we got someone going in, subbing in for Lincoln, and that's Andrew Johnson, who is a Democrat. Now, I don't mean this as a pejorative simply just because he's a Democrat. In fact, Johnson was actually quite in favor of poor Southerners. In fact, he hated the planter aristocracy. Me too. I think a lot of people hate them. However, the way he went about this was just not it. Why? He vetoed a lot of Reconstruction legislation. There were a lot of battles over Reconstruction legislation, such as the Force Acts, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And Congress is going to be, hey, Johnson, what the hell, dude? this is Reconstruction. We're trying to make things better, not become a more of a burning hellhole. Obviously, since Congress is going to be a majority, well, they're just going to pass over Johnson's veto. But that still doesn't matter. This is going to all come to a head in 1877. We're going to get the Compromise of 1877 that will ultimately end Reconstruction. Why? Well, the Republicans are going to make a deal with the Democrats. The Democrats will accept the Republican winner, that being Rutherford B. Hayes. In exchange, well, the Republican president, the Republican administration, I should say, is going to remove the troops from the military districts and let things stay as home rule. That is to say, leave all the fairs to the Southerners. And this is going to lead to disenfranchisement. It's going to lead to the entire collapse of Reconstruction, everything they have worked for. And we're going to see the rise of Jim Crow. Now we're going to talk about the failure of Reconstruction soon, but I do want to give you guys some context as to why this compromise happened, because I think it's a little useful. Depression. And I don't mean the mental health thing. I mean economic depression. We had a thing called the Long Depression in 1873, and if you guys think, oh, that must have been long. Yes, it was very long. It was also very bad. The only reason why we don't call the Great Depression the Long Depression is, well, we already had a Long Depression before. Both were bad. At the same time, the North is going to be exhausted. So, you got people worrying about the economy. You got people who are getting tired of, being shot by angry white men in the South. This is all going to lead to, maybe we should drop this whole Reconstruction ball. And that's where we end with, everything. But I do want to take a moment and talk about some things about the South after Reconstruction. We're going to see exploitation. We're going to see the rise of sharecropping, convict leasing systems, and tenant farming. So let me explain each of those. Sharecropping is going to be kind of a lease of land to a bunch of people. In exchange, those people are going to work as laborers, and they're going to give a share of their labor with the landlord. This system was kind of established in a way of, well, keeping the poor poor. In addition, the convict leasing systems are a way of getting free slavery, essentially. Free labor. It's called penal labor. And this is legal under the 13th Amendment. So, we'll get to this a little bit soon, but I want to move on to tenant farming. Tenant farming is very similar to sharecropping. Except this time, well, they can have the land, but they got to get their own tools. They got to, do things themselves. So again, all three of these systems are meant to keep the poor poor. At this point, we are going to see the rise of the nadir. And what this nadir means is just the lowest point of race relations in America. Things are going to get very, very bad. For example, I mentioned that we're going to see the rise of Jim Crow. We're going to see black codes. These black codes are kind of like vagrancy laws, etc. Very petty things that will keep African Americans kind of under a boot, kind of to keep them in jail, essentially. Jim Crow is not yet going to be a whole thing. That rises later during the Gilded Age. But you should know that these black codes are kind of the predecessors to the Jim Crow era. In addition to these black codes, these southern governments are going to pass various ways of keeping African Americans from voting. For example, poll taxes, literacy tests, and finally the grandfather clause. So these three things are quite important in African American studies. Why? Well, poll taxes. You got to pay money. You got to pay a tax to vote. Well, that's kind of hard to do if you don't have the money to pay the tax. Literacy tests. You have to pass this kind of educational thing in order to vote. How are you going to get that when you don't have enough money to afford an education? By the way, side preface, some of these literacy tests were impossible. These literacy tests sometimes were written in an entire foreign language. They were absolutely rigged in every way possible. Now, you might imagine, what about the white Southerners? I mean, some of them are poor. Some of them probably can't afford this. thing, and that's where the grandfather clause comes in. The grandfather clause states that, well, if your grandpa could vote, you can vote too. So this was an effective way of making sure that white people could only vote, but black people could not. Now, at the same time, we're also going to see violence, not just, legislative things that, or like little administrative things that will keep African Americans from voting. We're going to see violence and intimidation, literal physical violence inflicted on African Americans. Let me restate that. African Americans facing violence. Okay, I think I stated enough. How? Why? Well, we're going to see the rise of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, founded by this guy, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Of course, he is absolutely despicable and doesn't deserve a good statue picture, so I included the stupid picture statue that has been taken down. We're also going to see records. These, again, white, incredibly racist people that would go around intimidating African Americans. So things that they would do. They would intimidate African Americans from politically participating. They would also perform assassinations, for example, of leaders of urban leagues, or African American politicians, Republicans as well, Republican leaders, and just white people in general who supported this Reconstruction movement. So for instance, we're going to see the Camellia Massacre in 1868. We're going to see the Colfax Massacre in 1873. Those two massacres are actually explicitly mentioned in the CED, but you do not need to know them exactly very well. You just need to understand that at the same time, while we had this whole battle, legislative battle, there was also overt violence. And this is going to remain a constant throughout Unit 7, and we will try to address it in Unit 8 through the Civil Rights Movement. Again, I like to get ahead of myself again. So yeah, that's it for part 2. I know it was a little short. That's because I cut off all this FRQ portion, so it feels a little shorter. Of course, if you have any questions while you're watching the recording, feel free to ask during office hours. At the time of recording, I have 2 more office hours where you can hop on and ask any questions. Or you can hop on a lecture and ask me any questions about Unit 5. I know it's a little late recording this. It's because I haven't had enough time. But thank you for listening in. Yeah, again, as usual, questions are to be asked during office hours. That's what they're for. All right, awesome. I'll see you all in Unit 7, because that is the next unit I will be doing. Thank you so much.